Good evening, everyone. How are you this evening? I hope you're feeling well. Tonight, we have a very, very special evening in store for you. First, just to introduce myself for those who haven't come to our lecture series this year, my name is Sharon Loudon, and I'm the Artistic Director of Chautauqua Visual Arts at Chautauqua Institution. And what we do in this lecture series is share many different artists and people from all over the world to share give a place for them to share their knowledge. And every person that we bring forward is extremely generous. Tonight is, though, in fact, a very special lecture. Tonight is the Leon and Gloria Plevin Family Museum Director Lecture. The Plevin family is so generous, Leon and Gloria, to have given us an endowment to ensure that a museum person, director or curator, comes once a year to be able to share their knowledge and also provide access to our most esteemed, wonderfully fantastic, creative Chautauqua School of Art participants of our residency program. So this evening we have a very, very special person, and I'm hoping, I think Gloria is here and also her family. I am hoping, and Leon in spirit. I'm really grateful for their support of us. And Gloria is a wonderful artist. I don't know if you've ever seen her work, but I would highly recommend you doing a nice long Google search and spend some time with her work online or in person when we're able. Okay, so without further ado, and with great appreciation, like I said, to the Plevin family, I'm here to introduce Brooke Davis Anderson. So Brooke is incredible. I'm so excited that she's here with us this evening. As I mentioned, we only bring people who are generous forward, and she is absolutely one of the most generous people I've ever met. We were just talking, and I looked back at my notes, and I met her on November 1st, 2002, when she was the director and chief curator of the Folk Museum. So I'm going to talk about her, skip through her bio because it's quite extensive, because I don't want to hold back for everybody to hear her wonderful presentation about her life and work. So Brooke is the museum director at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts Museum in Philadelphia. And I don't know if everyone knows that the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts is the oldest art school in the country. And I think it dates back, and I'm sure Brooke may correct me if I'm wrong, either 1804, 1805. And it's quite a beautiful, beautiful museum and school if you've never been. Brooke's been at PAFA since 2017. And in this position, which she's going to be talking about, she's been responsible for building the permanent collection and exhibitions, and as I said, the first art museum and school in America. And central to her leadership is expanding and making elastic the American art story to include women artists and artists of color. And it's been widely publicized about how PAFA is leading the way nationally in its acquisitions of artists of color and women. So Brooke was recently honored by the Rush Philanthropic Arts with an award for her dedication to diversity in the arts. And I should just share with everyone that she's been doing this work for a very long time and brought her vision in, like I said, in 2017 with this mandate. So it's quite exceptional what she's doing there at PAFA. So prior to her moving to Philadelphia, she was the fourth executive director of Prospect New Orleans Biennial between 2013 and 2017. And then after that point, or I think that also she was, from 2010 to 2012, before that point, she was at LACMA, LA County Museum of Art, as the director of curatorial planning. She's had quite a bit of museum experience, like her, I think, in her entire life. At LACMA, and I know that was a really special role for her, she oversaw the Watts Towers conservation, and community collaboration, and the Curatorial Diversity Initiative, which was a Mellon-funded pilot program aiming to change the demographics of professionals in museums across the nation, which is very important. As I mentioned, from 1999 to 2010, Brooke was the founding director and curator of the Contemporary Center at the American Folk Art Museum in New York. Well, I didn't say it as fully as that, but I just remember it as the Folk Art Museum, which was located right across from the Museum of Modern Art, if you've never been, and that no longer exists. That building no longer exists. We were talking about that. So anyway, she's worked with many, many, many artists. She's also taught and an assistant professor at the following institutions: Columbia University, City College of New York, Winston-Salem State University. And she was also the first full-time director of the Diggs Gallery at Winston-Salem State University, where she tripled the budget, audience programming, and publicity. So she has done such an amazing amount of work that we're not going to be able to squeeze it all in this hour that we have together with her. But I would just please, if you don't mind, from afar and virtually, I'm giving her a big hand to welcome her to the Leon and Gloria Plevin Family Museum Director Lecture of the Chautauqua Visual Arts Lecture Series. So Brooke, welcome. And I'm just doing this because this is what we would do in person. So I'm going to wait for you to come up, and I'm going to say hello there. And where are you right now? Can you give us a stage? And I'm sorry I flubbed through you. I was so nervous because you've done so much in your life, and I'm stuttering through this, but I just am so grateful you're here. Where are you? Can you tell us where you're situated at? What is this corner that you're in? I didn't even ask you.
Yes, I know. It's pretty wonderful. Hi, Sharon. Hi, everybody. Well, you're finding me in Philadelphia, in the neighborhood of Kensington, which is a little north of Center City. And I live in an old converted parish house. So that's why we've got concrete boarded up old windows and brick, and we have lots of old things in this cool building that my husband and me. I wish I could be with all of you in person, of course. It would be lovely to be in upstate New York right now. But aren't we fortunate that we can figure out alternative ways to be together, to dialogue, and to explore the art world and what it means for each of us. So I'm glad to be with you all.
And I'm grateful. And now with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. I feel you already. I feel that you're with us. Okay, I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sharon. All right. So, well, hello, everyone. It is a funny thing being together and not seeing each of you. So please know that I am grateful to have the chance to talk with you. I want to thank Sharon for the invitation. It's very easy to say yes to Sharon. So all of you are lucky to be spending the summer with her. I also want to thank Chip, who hopefully is still around in the background, because I'm sure I'm going to need him at some point for all the technical skills. And I just want to also acknowledge Gloria Plevin, and thank you and your husband for and your family for your support of the arts. We need you. We need you all the time. We need you more than ever with this pandemic economy. So thanks for giving the opportunity for people like myself to share our stories with your community and the artists in it. So what we're going to do today and tonight is spend some time talking about my career, but I want to do it in a way that allows us all to think deeply about our networks and our communities, about access and sharing access. So I guess I am going to talk about my career a bit. It's a pretty unusual one. I did not take a conventional path, but I'm hoping that it will serve some other bigger purposes in the way that we build our art worlds, because I'm presuming that those of us who are on this call are already starting the evening committed to an art world that reflects the communities we envision for our country and for our local sites as well. So I have I think about 13 slides. And what I did was trying to figure out how to visually represent my career. I'm certainly not going to show pictures of me from 25 on. So, I mean, I would only do that for my mother, and she would love that. So what I realized I could do, which felt very fulfilling to me, is I was able to utilize PAFA's permanent collection, which is extraordinary, as a way to kind of tell my story. And what excited me about that is that PAFA and I only collided 3 years ago, but somehow its permanent collection illustrates my story. So that kind of excited me because it matters to me to care about the work at PAFA. And I was able to concoct for this talk a personal connection to the artists I'm going to show, to the artwork I'm going to share. And I might not dwell in the artwork. I think I'm going to use it as an illustrative tool tonight, but I'm happy. We do have a Q&A together, and I'm happy to go back to it at any time. So I'm going to talk. We're going to have a Q&A. I believe that's the structure you're accustomed to. And I'm really looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to the conversation after the talk. And when I think about my career, and I am going to take you chronologically through it, but I want to say that probably like a lot of art world leaders, it's about passion, my career, deep passion for audiences, artists, and art. And I intentionally put audiences first. The mission, I think it's really important in a career to feel that there is a drive and purpose and mission to what we're doing. It's hard work, and the purpose and purposefulness with which we do it is something I think a lot about. Artists and New York credibility. I'll get to that in the middle of my talk with a little bit of cynicism, if you don't mind. I have been a New Yorker for a long time. And then how we can dance and play in the space of art history and experiment with art history as opposed to assume that it's a science that's finished. And I've probably spent much of my career doing that too, and that excites me a lot. So I guess in short, what I want to do is share things that have excited me and talk a little bit about my trajectory through the images we're going to look at. They're all pretty fantastic, and end it with today and PAFA now. And then open it up for conversation. So I can't see you guys, and I hope you're all thinking that sounds somewhat like an interesting way to spend your Tuesday evening. So my passion really began when I was young, a child. And I'm starting with it as a child specifically because my career path was articulated by me pretty young. And Bearden, Ramar Bearden, as you see here in this wonderful color lithograph from the 1970s from PAFA's permanent collection. So I was very fortunate as a young person to be surrounded by museum professionals. I don't think there are a lot of young people who can say that. But my grandmother, with whom I was very close, was a secretary at Yale University's Art Gallery. And Yale University's Art Gallery is one of the best university museums in our country. It's one of the oldest in our country. And it has a distinguished collection of American art and art from all over the globe. And their African-American art collection is actually pretty strong and started relatively early for a mainstream majority white institution like Yale. My grandmother was the secretary to the museum director. So I have a lot of full circle moments in my life because I was very close to her. She was a secretary, and now I have an assistant to me as museum director. And I think about her all the time because parenthetically, she is from Philly and studied at PAFA and wanted to be an artist. Never became an artist, but worked in the arts her entire career. And when my mother needed to dump me somewhere to go do something, it was often at the Yale University Art Gallery. And it was often to be babysat by my grandmother. And this might sound very personal, but it's pretty formative for me because the first two artists I loved as a very young girl in the New Haven area were Ramar Bearden, seen here in this print from PAFA's permanent collection, and Jacob Lawrence. And both of those artists were collected by Yale in the 50s. And I got to roam those galleries as a young child of an employee. And these were the two works that thrilled me. I'm fairly certain that what thrilled me about Bearden and Lawrence were the bold colors and the rich forms, the kind of dominant forms that often cover both of their compositions, the energy and the narrative, the storytelling that both Bearden and Lawrence are so adept at telling in their works. So Bearden and Lawrence were out of the gate, two of my pantheon of favorite artists, and it never changed. It never changed. It's still true today. While I never got to meet Ramar Bearden, sadly, probably missed him by 6 degrees of separation, as you'll hear in a little while, I did get to meet Jacob Lawrence. I did work on an exhibition with Jacob Lawrence in the 1990s. And we ended up in the way that is a privilege of being in the art world, befriending artists. I know there's an artist friend in this call. We ended up exchanging Christmas cards for about a decade before Jacob Lawrence died. So we felt a great affinity for one another. And I have always been drawn to how Lawrence organizes his image bank, and had come to learn through my self-study that, Lawrence would work a page with first primary colors. So he would dabble down all blues and then all reds and then all yellows, and then he would add the green and the orange and the black and the brown, and he would build up his composition almost like a puzzle, color by color. And as a young kid, I just found that exhilarating to learn that that was a way that a famous artist would work. So that was my childhood. I was also someone in my childhood who had the opportunity to see a lot of art in homes because I had an aunt who collected folk art, self-taught art, and my father eventually started to collect international folk art. And it was possibly their collecting habits that got me interested in and open-minded to receive the self-taught aesthetic as a rich, valid, smart, educated way of seeing. And it was in college that I took my first art history class, and it was in college that I saw my first images of the artist Horace Pippin. You're looking at a Horace Pippin here, and I'm going to show us a few because he's an artist I really would love everyone to know about. And if you don't know of Pippin's work, he was an African-American artist who was active in Chester County, which is just a stone's throw from where I am now, right outside of Philadelphia. And he was someone who started art making after returning from World War I. He was injured in the war. And so he came back and started to pick up painting and was supported by everyone from Alfred Barnes to the community in Chester County to museums like PAFA and the Philadelphia Museum of Art and beyond. He had a very successful career, a career that any artist would be proud to have during his lifetime, and extraordinarily self-taught in his act of painting and carving. And PAFA is partly because we're in Pennsylvania, his home state. We have a wonderful collection of Horace Pippins. And Horace Pippin is deeply close to me because when I was a teenager, after Bearden and after Lawrence, I had the opportunity to intern in museums as a young teen and really took to the kind of work that I imagined museums to require. And so as a very young person, I kind of decided I wanted to be a museum director. So at some point, hopefully one of you will ask me a question that's about the difficulties of being a museum director, and I can talk about being careful what you wish for. But it was a very early impulse of mine that I've been thinking about a lot lately, to be a museum director. And Pippin was someone who was in my learning about art history and thinking a lot about what defines art history. Because when I was coming up in the 80s, there weren't many outlets for artists, scholarly books and catalogs and information about artists like Pippin or even Bearden or Lawrence. You could fill a good bookshelf with the books on African-American artists like Bearden, Lawrence, and Pippin in the 80s when I realized that this was the work that I wanted to commit myself to. Is everybody doing okay so far? Another Pippin from our permanent collection at PAFA, and I wanted to pull this work out because I'm assuming some of you are New Yorkers. And all things being safe in New York in the fall, we are going to be lending this one painting, John Brown Going to His Hanging, from 1942 to Hunter College and to the Hunter's University Museum. They did a colloquium with 6 noted curators, none of them affiliated with PAFA, from around the country. They did a colloquium last year to examine which they all felt was the most important painting in America. And after a semester-long conversation about what's the most important painting in America, it's this painting that ended up getting selected and given the moniker by this group of curators as the most important painting in America. And so they're going to be doing a show about the discussion around what defined an important painting today in America. And we're going to be lending this Pippin to that show. So keep your eye out for that project because in some ways it's going to be connected to how I end my talk in talking about American art. So I went to college and studied art history and developed, because there were no museum study courses back in the early 1980s when I was in college, I made up my own. So I developed my own museum studies certificate program and developed, I think, the first museum studies certificate program in the country for undergrad. So you can tell I'm a nerd. You can tell that I'm very committed to this sector. And you can tell that I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I still have a ton of things to learn, but it's been my life's passion for a long time. So there we get back to passion. Whoop. Well, that's one of my favorite pieces, but I'm going to go back to another Pippin, a portrait of an elk. And just with this majestic animal in our view and in our vision tonight, one reason why I was drawn to administrative work in the arts sector and museums specifically is because I grew up around, believe it or not, 4 museum directors, quite unusual, quite fortunate. My mother was drawn to creative people And in New Haven, there was a small and vital arts community that's still there with new people. And I grew up around 3 women who were museum directors in Connecticut. I was someone who was clearly seeking at 13 years old mentors and models of women who would present themselves in a way that I wanted to think of myself as being an adult. And one of them is Virginia Mann, who just died 3 weeks ago of lung cancer. So I mentioned a moment ago that I've been thinking a lot about my early decisions to go into this business and not to hover in my childhood too much longer, but just to acknowledge that my first mentor, when I was a teenager, remained a huge presence and force in my life throughout the many steps that I've made in my career. And I'll probably be bringing up networks a lot. And that was the beginning of my networks. The 3 women who happened to be my mom's friends, who also happened to be museum directors in Connecticut. And there you go. It kind of set me on a path that clearly is not yet finished. So my work in college was focused on self-taught artists. I was deeply drawn to the work. There was not a lot of scholarly publications and exhibitions about self-taught artists when I was in college. That's changed somewhat in the last 30 years. Still could be better. And I think the fact that I saw this absence of attention to artists who had not formal training, but had training of a different sort, made me feel that I had a place to be an advocate for artists who had no formal training. And so again, that sort of set me on a path that I really haven't, that I continue to be on, even though my scope has extended a lot. It really did begin with self-taught artists. And so I'm going to skip ahead to my first museum directorship. When I was 26 years old, I was lucky because it was my first major job after grad school. I went to NYU and got a degree as a museum studies art history major at NYU. And I was very fortunate that the search committee at Winston-Salem State University saw something in my experience that matched up what they were looking for, because I didn't have a whole lot of experience as a newly graduate student. But they hired me to be the first museum director of their university museum at Winston-Salem State University called the Diggs Gallery. And it was 1991 when I arrived. It had been open for about 9 months with an acting director from the art department in the position. And in ways that I think are really telling and revealing. The first show that was up when I started there was the collection of Eli Leon's African-American quilts that have recently gotten an awful lot of attention because when Eli Leon passed away last year, he left his entire quilt collection to, oh gosh, it just left my head, in Berkeley to the Yerba Buena Art Center. And there was a recent story about the gift and the show that's up in the New York Times. So that was my first show, and that felt like a great moment because, of course, it echoed my interest in self-taught artists and in African-American art. So a lot of our careers are interjected with relationship building, and I mentioned Jacob Lawrence and becoming close to him in the course of working on an exhibition with him in the 90s at Winston-Salem State University. But I also became very close to the North Carolina artist, a Houston-based North Carolinian-born artist, John Biggers, who died in 2001, and with whom I worked very closely for more than a decade, because we had at Winston-Salem State 2 major murals by the artist a version of the mural, one of the murals, is represented in this gorgeous print that was produced at Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia by John Biggers and assisted by Alan Edmonds at Brandywine. And to reference another full circle, because I'm sure you all have full circle stories too, I now work about 5 blocks away from the Brandywine Workshop, and this is a print that I've known since 1992, and now I live and work and collaborate in a community where this was produced at that time. John and I became very close because I was responsible for interpreting the murals at Winston-Salem State entitled Origins and Ascensions. And if you ever want to talk about John, there's a couple of us who were tour guides of the Biggers murals at Winston-Salem State, and they're absolutely masterful works of art. If you ever drive through Winston-Salem or the Triad region of North Carolina, please do yourself a favor and go to Winston-Salem State and see the 2 murals that John produced in 1990 that are in the library on campus. An essential stop in understanding the breadth and depth of American art. So at Winston-Salem State, I had the fortune of leading an institution with the following mission. The mission of Diggs Gallery was to tackle the racial divide of the community through the work of the museum, specifically exhibitions, collection building, and interpretation public programs. So again, the mission didn't start like most museums, saying that the mission of the museum is to collect, interpret, and exhibit art from the collection and elsewhere. That's most museums. Diggs Gallery at Winston-Salem State clearly stated that the mission of its institution is to tackle the racial divide in the community utilizing exhibitions, collections, and programming. So it was for me, as my first museum directorship, an extraordinary opportunity to see what happens when a museum audience is truly integrated, which we were able to do, which other museums in the region had not really been able to tackle and succeed in. And I think there are 1,000 reasons for why we were successful. And I will tell you that I was there for 10 years. I was there in the 1990s. I realize now that I'm 20 years away from that, or more actually, 20 years away from that, that I'm always trying to recreate that mission that I was first charged with in my first job, and also recreate that audience. I might not have been able to articulate that so clearly a couple of decades ago, but there's no doubt upon reflection that that is my purpose. And that is, I hope, something that I aim for every day. This is a lovely Willie Birch. I also had the good fortune of working on a show with Willie in Winston-Salem, and I just love this image. It's currently on view at the museum at PAFA, and of course we're still closed due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, but it will be there when we reopen. So hopefully you'll all come and visit. At Winston-Salem State, we worked with an incredible roster of artists. We worked with Allison Sarr. We worked with her mom, Betty Sarr. Again, these are works from PAFA's collection, not from the projects that I did in the 1990s elsewhere. And I'm just going to diverge for a minute and kind of not be chronological to also say that what was so interesting in thinking about my presentation to you all is how artists like Allison and Willie also appear later in my career working in other jobs in New Orleans and Los Angeles. So I had the privilege of running Prospect New Orleans for 4 years. I would say that for me, that project was also deeply engaged in building an audience that was reflective of New Orleans. The challenge was that the audience was the art world. And we know that the majority art world is a majority homogenous white art world. So one of my tasks that I wanted to accomplish at Prospect was to really integrate that biennial audience and serve New Orleanians. Willie was a part of that work when I was there. I also had I'm pleased to share, because part of being a museum director is being a good fundraiser. And we might not talk about that a lot tonight, though if that's a question, I'm happy to address that. But Prospect had always had a debt and had always been in a deficit situation. And in the time that I was there, I ended up closing the debt for all of the prior biennials, as well as the ones that I produced. So that was a lot of really rewarding work to make the institution healthy. And when I was at LACMA, I had the good fortune of working often with Allison and Betty, who are LA-based artists. If you don't know them and you don't know their work, please take the time right after this talk, or even during this talk, because we all do that, to get to know both Allison and Betty. They are important American artists who have work in the public sphere, as well as working more studio scale. So I am gonna go next to my work with self-taught art. So after being a museum director in North Carolina for a decade, I then was lured to New York by the American Folk Art Museum, who was building a new building on 53rd Street. And so in 2000, I went to New York after 10 years in North Carolina. It was really not an easy decision for me to make. I know that at Diggs I had an awesome job, but I also thought it would be incredibly exciting to contribute to a new museum building in New York. And I figured that there would not be many opportunities to, in New York City, be a part of a new building from the ground up. It doesn't happen all the time in New York. It happens about once every 10 years. And that to me felt like an extraordinary opportunity. So I joined the American Folk Art Museum and a new department to tell the story of contemporary self-taught artists, which was a space that the museum had touched upon but had not really committed itself to. And so you all might know of this work as outsider art, or art brut, or intuitive art. It's all of those things. I tend to call it self-taught or vernacular. And I had a 12-year run in New York at the Folk Art Museum. And interestingly, did most of my, well, not so interesting to all of you perhaps, but interesting in the scheme of a trajectory of a ladder. I did most of my scholarly work there. So I started out as a museum director, went to New York to be a curator of a new department in an ambitious museum, or a museum that was ambitious, for 10 years, and did a lot of my curatorial growth in New York City, and spent most of my time with the Chicago-based artist Henry Darger and the Mexican-born California-based artist Martin Ramirez, and had just frankly a ball being a curator. I never wanted to be a curator. I always felt my skill set was more in a leadership role, an administrative role, and a role of advocacy and fundraising and supporting a team of curators. But I found myself in this curatorial role, and I had so many awesome opportunities that I am very grateful to have had that 12 years of experience being on the production side of exhibitions and collection building, publications, and speaking. And I am very committed to integrating self-taught artists into the more mainstream canon. It's something that I've spent a lot of time doing and thinking about and researching and preparing for. And I think I did that, and with my colleagues, with Ramirez and Darger. And I hope most people on this call have heard of those two artists. You might not have in the 90s, but I hope you have by now in the in the 21st century. If you haven't, I'd be curious to know that, because my sense is that they have become more embraced by the mainstream. So that was a 12-year decade of pursuing my scholarly side. And because I believe as we get to know each other and make networks, it's important to be candid about things that I feared. I've always felt that I was never a good writer. So being a curator was very challenging for me. It was not the space that I thought I was most adept at, most intuitive at. And it turns out that I was a good enough writer to publish a few books and many articles and all the rest of it. But I bring that up because I'm assuming that all of us are committed to our art making careers on this call. And that was a space that I was quite intimidated about. And I spent 12 years in that space. And I'm not as, I don't have that fear about my writing. It's the hardest thing for me to do still, but I think that my outcomes make a contribution. So I have a different position about me as a writer than I did 20, 30 years ago. We could talk about bad mentors and my insecurities about my writing, because I can also point very easily to why I thought I was a bad writer, because when I was 21, an art gallerist, a gallerist told me that. And for whatever reason, that hovered in my space as something that was true. And I wonder if any of you can relate to that. It's so important for all of us to be the best mentors we can be. The art world is a mysterious place. It's often not a compassionate place. It's often a very competitive space. And mentoring is something that I think we all need to make a commitment to. Coming to a close so that we can open up to dialogue. I have 2 more slides. So I was running a biennial, Prospect New Orleans, and I was doing the job from a different city. I was living in New York. The triennial of Prospects produced in New Orleans. I was feeling very disconnected to my audience. I went to New Orleans every month. I traveled in and out all the time, but I was aware that I was, after 4 years, longing for that day-to-day connection with an audience that you get in a museum. So it was clear to me that while the triennial making is totally an exhilarating space in the art world, I was yearning to get back to institutional work where I could develop relationships with audiences. And Philadelphia interested me for several reasons. It's a second city, and I think second city museums have more potential for partnerships and collaboration, community immersion, and audience relationships. So I was pretty enamored of the possibilities at PAFA because of its location in Philadelphia. And the idea of working for another American art museum, because the American Folk Art Museum is only committed to American art. And American art has been, with the exception of my work in African art with African artists, American art has been the space that I've dwelled in the most. And PAFA intrigued me not only because it was the first art museum in America, founded in 1805, with an art school attached to it, which was alluring to be surrounded by art students, of course, every day. But PAFA has a healthy acquisitions budget, and it wants that acquisitions budget to be utilized to reshape the American art narrative. And I just thought, oh my God, if I can play even a little baby role, a minor role in the way that we understand American art, I am in. And if I can do it with purchases of women artists and artists of color, all the better. If we can, my team and I, question the parameters of a conventional American art history, challenge the way that we assume the art history has no more stories to be told. If we can do that, and if I can be part of that, that was so juicy and so exciting to me that I am now at PAFA to do that. And my team and I have some, I'd say, really hefty and ambitious and exciting ideas to do that. We've started, and we hopefully even with the pandemic, and in fact, one of our projects will touch upon the idea of the pandemic. It would feel deeply gratifying to dip my toe into the long art history of this country, but to challenge the norms and to, I hope, electrify audiences with new ideas of American art. So that's where we are now, and I'm going to show two last images of PAFA, two major acquisitions that illustrate that retelling. Hank Willis Thomas's, Philadelphia native, by the way. Hank is a New York artist, but born here in Philly. Hank created this Afro pick for a site-specific project in Philadelphia 3 years ago. And it was such a great sculpture that we purchased it for our collection, and it's now on view, looking out on the storefront of our art school building on North Broad Street, if you're familiar with Philadelphia. And then I'm going to close with this one image. I hope you can see it in entirety, which seems so important for us to look at and see now. And hopefully we can talk about it. I hope you all are familiar with the artist Sonia Clark. She's currently in Amherst, Massachusetts. She's a professor at Amherst College. She's from Washington, D.C. She's an artist who started in the craft world and now has absolutely dismantled those silly boundaries about craft versus fine art, and is working in a lot of installations and site-specific projects and commissions. And she has been presenting as a performance Unraveling for the last 5 years. I've been to every performance. There have been 5 so far, I think 5. We were the first museum to purchase Unraveling, but the performance is the thing. Sonia invites all of us to meet her at the flag, and one by one we join her and we take it apart. And it's a hard thing to do, and taking apart the Confederacy has proven to be a hard thing for this country to do. And the flag is no different. And so you stand, if you can imagine 2 of us standing, or Sonia and someone else, one of you, standing in front of the flag by that shelf and slowly but surely taking apart the cotton threads, the remnants of which stay on the shelf, and we just take the Confederacy apart. And it's an extraordinary work where you are in dialogue with the artist about the action, or not. Sometimes she'll talk about other things with other people. It's exhausting work for her, as most performances are for artists, as I'm sure many of you know. And she's never been successful at unraveling the entire flag. So it's a 5-year-long project that still has not completely dismantled one Confederate flag. We had this in our rotunda, and I'll tell you a little story about PAFA. I think this would have happened at most museums around the country. I was new. I had been at PAFA for 3 months when the anniversary of the election of our current president was coming up, November of 2017. And I wanted to create a space in the museum for people to gather, to make art, to meet with artists, to talk with one another about what it has been like the past year. This now feels like a century ago. And so we wanted to create a space to being a gathering place for anybody and everybody. And we decided to be free that weekend. And we brought a wonderful printmaker from Detroit, Amos Kennedy Jr., who made prints with people that had slogans about democracy and social justice and fairness. And then Sonia came and did her performance. And I'll tell you, I was new to the institution, and there was some unease about the PAFA having on view in its museum, in its sort of storied museum space where all the masterworks of American art, to have a Confederate flag in this space. And there was a real concern by our leadership that there might be protests of groups that were pro-Confederacy if they learned about this flag being on view. And I'll be honest with you, I hadn't quite taken that into consideration. And so there was a lot of deliberation and planning and negotiating that had to take place before that weekend anniversary in November of 2017 in order to make everyone at PAFA feel secure and comfortable about this performance taking place. What's great about the institution is the performance did take place, and we did have a few undercover security guards, more than normal, just in case there would have been disruptions and opposition to taking apart a flag. And there were about 75 Philadelphians who came and unraveled with Sonia for about 4 hours on the anniversary of our current president's election. And it was so moving. It is such a moving performance that people left crying. It's very emotional to participate in democracy, as we all know, because of how we all are participating now. And I am deeply interested in how museums can be active partners in that participation. And Sonia's performance was one of my first demonstrations of that commitment to Philadelphia. And I think that's a good stop, Sharon, if you agree. And I want to thank you guys for letting me share my story. And I hope we have questions about art and artists or comments about some of the things that I've shared. And I really thank you for your time.
Wow, that was amazing. I have so many questions. Let's see, I first, before I warm up everyone, I just want to say thank you. That was extraordinary. And then also to everyone here, if you'd like to ask a question, you just need to click on to your camera, microphone or camera symbol next to your name, and that will lead you into a queue. And as soon as a question is finished being answered by Brooke, or conversation has ended to a good break, we'll bring you up on the screen with us. Or you can just ask a question in the chat, and I'm happy to repeat it and to Brooke. So if Chip doesn't mind, we'll go on the screen. And Brooke, oh my gosh, I have a lot of questions. First, Mimi Plevin Faust, who's a wonderful, oh my gosh, screenwriter, poet, fantastic artist herself, part of one of the children of Plevin family. She's asking, can Brooke talk about any influence the Guerrilla Girls may have had on her? Did she purchase any of their artworks?
Hi, Mimi. Thanks, and thanks, Sharon. So I think I started the talk out by fessing up to being an idiosyncratic art world person, because my trajectory has been rooted in self-taught artists and African-American artists. So I'll be honest, the Guerrilla Girls are artists who came late to my knowledge base, if that's I think that's the fair way to say it. I certainly became aware of the Guerrilla Girls, but late in my career, because I have been deeply committed to the vernacular voice, and I really feel that that's a very renegade place to be in the art world. And so what I can say about the Guerrilla Girls is I certainly became aware of them later in my career. And I'm happy to report that we did acquire the portfolio of the Guerrilla Girls 10-year production of posters and flyers and billboards, recreated small, in a beautiful anniversary box. You might have seen this in other museums because they were offered largely to museums. And we put them on view this winter. We unfortunately closed March 13th due to COVID-19, so its viewing was shortened, but it's in our permanent collection. And because of the 19th Amendment celebration that our institution is engaging in for the next 2 years, it will come back out in the coming years. So you can come and see it at some point in the future. I wouldn't say that they've been influential to me, however, but I respect greatly their contributions.
Thank you. And thank you, Mimi. So before we wait for other questions, I have a burning question for you. And this has to do with the trajectory of museums today. I think museums are in a hard place because there have been for many, many years, the history of museums as being very exclusive, defined by class and having white walls and nobody can enter in that unless there's a lot of intimidation, I think, by the public. Now, PAFA is really different. And what you've done at PAFA, which I really love, is you'll have a contemporary piece up with something, let's say from the 19th century or what have you, and then you will display it in context and it becomes an education. But can you, sorry for the siren, if you're hearing it, that's Chautauqua. Actually, I'm at Chautauqua and there's a siren that goes off every now and then. Sorry, can't help it.
Okay.
But anyway, the thing I was going to ask you is what can museums do today, to really survive? I mean, honestly, it's like I think that artists and museums have done it to themselves because of centering to the marketplace, right? When it's always been so exclusive. So what can we do to break that open, which I think you were doing, but how can we also get museum people to go out into those neighborhoods versus always having people to come in?
Yeah. I would also add that the museums in America have been really great at creating boundary barriers based not only on class, Sharon, but on race. And many museums have been deeply successful at remaining elitist. My team and I have been talking about this a lot lately, all summer long. And I really think there's a place for a museum like PAFA to focus on the local as their success barometer. So I think everybody on this call must know museums and museum professionals because we're all in the industry. Well, you know how we all have a capacity to kind of look to New York and LA, and those museums in New York and LA are kind of the models for how every museum ought to behave and programs that they ought to implement. There's this other thing that happens where museums and teams within museums are kind of aiming for the affirmation from Art Forum and Art in America and the New York Times. So we have this kind of national tendency to want to have the audience of, say, you, Sharon, that I'm serving you as an art world type, or a collector or a donor or a Roberta Smith. And I love Roberta Smith. She's reviewed many of my shows and given me great reviews, thankfully. But there's this tendency to work for our peers in the art world.
Right.
What I'm really interested in is working for Philadelphia and serving Philadelphia. And knowing that if my team and I do that really well, and we have a lot of work to do it really well, we then become the national model for how a museum stays successful and stays alive. I think if we look to serving our local cities and communities, we have a better chance of surviving this new economy than a museum that's looking to doing things the way the Met does it, to just take a random major museum in a big city. So we've been talking a lot about that as our focus. Certainly that's been my career focus, so it seems to have been how I've operated, and I've seen how it succeeds and how it gets more donors, more support, bigger audiences, more relevancy, and obviously contributing to the next generation, which is essential.
Awesome. Now, let's see, can you, somebody's saying something's gone wrong with your sound. Is everything okay? I can hear you okay. Thank you, Mimi. Amy Cousins, who is one of our exceptional artists in our program, asked this question. She says, I'm curious how you think about reshaping the art world as different from reshaping art history. Do you have any particular mission in showing living artists versus artists from history that didn't get their due? And I think that's a lot of what you've done in your whole history and what you do at PAFA too.
Yeah, that's a really cool question, Amy. Thank you. Are you an artist? Is Amy an artist, or I'm just mostly curious more than anything else? I guess you're going to have to type that that answer.
She can answer that herself, but I can say that Amy, she's saying yes. She's one of the participants of our program.
Awesome. Oh, great. So I'll probably talk with you again. So I think that they are bound together, that they're reshaping the art world is by default or by intention reshaping art history. And you know, I have spent a good bit of my time working both with living artists and deceased artists, historic artists. And I have seen how you can shift the narrative to widen our understanding of any artist, whether they're living or dead, in meaningful ways, and dismantle kind of these, the way that we've relied so heartily on a kind of white male dominant narrative in art history, and a Eurocentric narrative of art history.
Right.
I alluded to some work with African artists and artwork, and I have been in that space quite a lot throughout my career, and have always kind of positioned my understanding from a Black Atlantic frame. So my foundation is maybe a little bit different than a lot of other art historians, because it begins from the Black Atlantic world, and I position my worldview from there, and so they feel intertwined to me. I've never quite asked the question to myself in such a separate fashion, and I'm appreciating your question a lot. You know, when you're in the museum world, I'm looking at your question now. So when you're in the museum world, you are kind of doing both at the same time, because, you know, I'm going to be gone and PAFA's collection is going to still be around. I mean, it might get deaccessioned one day, but chances are that what my team and I are doing now, hopefully for the next 10 years or so, will be around in 100 years at PAFA. And that collection will be shaping the curators who are working with it in 100 years. And it will be shaping the stories they tell the publics in 100 years. And so I do feel like they're pretty linked. But I like this question a lot, and I'm going to want to think about it some more. I might have a little more to say about it in a little while.
Yeah, I have a follow-up that has to do with Katie Schulman's question, who's also a participant in our program this season. She asks, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about or expand on, quote, second cities, unquote, and the partnering potentials within them. What would you count as a second city? Could you give some examples of partnerships? And she says, I think that was the term used, sorry if not. Before you answer that, I also want to just have an extension of that too, is what about museums partnering with one another? I mean, it seems like too that there should be exchanges at this moment to even locally in order to support one another as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me start by maybe using New York as an example of what I don't think is a space for partnerships. So I worked in I worked in New York for 20 years, off and on, and know New York well. I'm from Connecticut. You know, New York was always our center. I was there for a long time, and I was able to cobble a partnership with the Studio Museum in Harlem, which was wonderful, for 1 year, and a sort of partnership with MoMA because we shared a wall for not very long, but did that partnership for about a year. It's almost always in education, so it's almost always living in the education department, public programming. And I think it's because in New York, it's almost like museums don't need partnerships to get their audiences. I mean, there's a rich cultural community and audience in New York City. And culture tourists in New York are really good at kind of doing everything and going everywhere. It's kind of amazing. A second city like Philadelphia doesn't have that cultural community in such large numbers to support cultural institutions like in a second city like Philly. I think another second city would be not in population, but maybe Atlanta and Detroit. I would say are, to my mind, second cities. This is no statistic that I know. This is just more my kind of thinking a lot about spaces that are open to working together. And I know in Detroit, there are countless partnerships. So part of it is an understanding that in Philadelphia, we actually need to work together to build all of our audiences together. So there is a need in a partnership program. Philadelphia is not a wealthy city culturally. We have a lot of cultural wealth. We have a lot of great museums. We have a lot of great cultural organizations. None of them have the kind of budgets that bigger cities have. So we're all doing a lot with not so much, with a little. And we have a very small convener of the arts sector. So in New York, you guys have the Department of Cultural Affairs with a big budget, with great leaders, and it's meaningful. In Philadelphia, we don't have that. Philadelphia's city budget for the arts is $4 million. That's it. 2 million of that 4 million goes to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So that means that—
Really? My God.
Because it's a city, it's on city property, and it's—
Oh, I see.
That means that 2 million of 4 million, which is really tiny budget, New Orleans got distributed more than 4 million to New Orleans cultural institutions. So we have a very slim art budget and a very minimal office of urban and citywide support. So it's up to us to build those partnerships. And I'll tell you, it's one reason why I came to Philly, because I had this instinct that Philadelphia might be open to partnerships. We're smaller, we're friendlier, we know we need each other. We have a lot of intersections with board members and patron members and schools that we all work with. So it's a space in Philly, and I did find this in North Carolina and New Orleans as well, and LA a little bit. When I started, I got a call from the CEO at the Barnes, Tom Collins. It was as simple as, Brooke, we're doing a Bill Viola show. You have a Bill Viola in your collection that's one of the best videos by Viola, according to the artist. So the artist pushed this agenda. Why don't you put yours up when we're doing our show, and we'll cross market? And we did that. And then it turned out that the Fabric Workshop owned a Bill Viola and produced a Bill Viola in the 2000s. So they put theirs on view. And, you know, for the people who love to walk, it's a walk. It's a 15-minute walk between each venue, I would guesstimate. And we cross-marketed. And, you know, I have to tell you, with partnerships like this, perception leads to action. So it was the first time the three entities had worked together. Wow. And it's very exciting to me because everybody in Philly heard about the partnership. They didn't all do it. They didn't go to all three venues, but they heard about it and they were thrilled that we were working together. And if you think long view as a museum director, you know that the next time you partner together, they'll start to go. So it's like building trust with your audience that you're going to keep doing this. So our next collaboration is with Isaac Julien and at several institutions around Philly. And that trust and partnership started with Bill Viola. And I would just quickly say that PAFA is planning a major project in a couple of years about democracy and how we've never actually achieved it. And we're going to be working with 30 artists, and it's a partnership with AMP, the African American Museum in Philly. And we're not just sharing an exhibition, we're actually sharing our volunteers. So I've not seen this yet, but it's something I've been wanting to do for a while. I've not seen another museum do this. But we're going to swap our volunteers so that my volunteers become experts at the African American Museum, and the African American Museum volunteers become
that's brilliant.
PAFA. Yeah. And we're cross-pollinating beyond just the exhibition program. And that is because together we tell a more fulsome art history and American story.
It's great. We have about 4 questions coming up here, but before we ask, I just have to ask this. You're mentioning 2 really big art world artists, Viola and Isaac Julien. What about the 99% of the artists? And we can, and I don't want to take time away from the artists who are asking questions here, and we can talk about that tomorrow night, but I do want to ask you publicly, because you have been working for so many artists who aren't in that spotlight, but here you just spoke about 2 of them who have been overwhelmingly talked about for years.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we obviously need to bring diversity in all of the ways that you do. Young artists, older artists, established artists, younger artists. We actually have a program for the next 5 years that leads with women and artists of color. So those are our major projects, and all pretty exciting projects. So we are always balancing that story out and balancing the who. And I would say that shows up as well in the acquisition program. I think we have a really youthful acquisitions program. We're really buying, we actually have a mandate from our board of trustees to really try and buy and purchase and add artists who are young and at the start of their careers, who our curator of contemporary art has identified as an artist that we're excited about for their career in the future. So we do that a lot. I'd say it's pretty diverse. We had a show of a mid-career artist that's still touring the country. We originated a show that's currently going to open in Nashville when we reopen, when they reopen, of the mid-career artist Rena Banerjee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, that's great. And I know that I had to have you say that, because so many of these artists are not at that level, right? So, okay. So Leslie Fandrick, who is one of our participants as well, says, I was wondering if you could talk about how your museum is creating online experiences for audiences during this time, and how maybe that can help open up the museum to larger audiences even past this moment. I would imagine so, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Leslie, thank you for asking that.
Oh, you're so good.
So we are a small museum. We really are. We are a small museum, a small team, fearless team, a passionate team. And we all went home March 13th. with not a whole lot of warning. And that's a whole nother story. And we've been working remotely ever since. And we had just opened 5 shows. We had it's just 5 shows for the winter, spring, and they only each collectively got, 4 to 6 weeks. It was a real disappointment. We looked at each other and we didn't know, and no one knew, how long are we going to be here? How long is this going to go on for? Oh my gosh, our dear members and audiences, we can't just disappear. And I will say that PAFA really showed up. Within 10 days, we were offering 4 online programs a week. We had no money to do this, so the content fell upon me and my 3 curators. I have 3 curators on the staff. And so the museum director and the 3 curators worked with the education team, and it was our role to provide the content. So the first thing we did, which was very museum-y, and I think it's what our members wanted, is we pointed to the shows that nobody could see. And it happened to be permanent collection projects, so it did 2 things. It honored our core role and also our exhibition program. And but obviously what has it been? It's been 19 weeks. So we then started, we had no budget for online programming. We couldn't pay a speaker. I could invite Caleb Lindsay, who's on the call, or Sharon, who's on the call, but I wouldn't have been able to pay them. And we actually we morally think that's wrong. That's not our principle at PAFA in the museum. So it relied, the stressful thing was that it relied all on staff. We actually had an audience that was hungry for this.
Oh, wow.
We had everywhere from 50 people to, in some events, we had 250 people joining us. Sometimes it was free, sometimes it wasn't. We were so experimental. We were trying all sorts of things. But the online audience for PAFA is real, and we didn't know. And I'll tell you something about the pandemic and the time that we're living in now. It's a really unsettling time. It's scary. It's a violent time, and we are so nervous about our rights and our moral compass and our ability to believe in justice here. But we also have to believe that it's a transformational time. And one of the things that I'm seeing is how we are all capable of things we didn't know we could do, and that this horrible time is showing us what we are capable of. And PAFA last year would have told you, everybody at PAFA would have told you that we don't have the capacity to do online. We don't have the technology, we don't have the know-how, we don't have the time, we don't have the ability, X, Y, Z, 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 and who's gonna chime in? Do we even have an audience? And because we found ourselves in a pandemic, indoors, we actually learned that we were quite capable of doing this, and it's not going away. And just very quickly, the reason why it's not going away is I did a talk with 2 Philadelphia artists, Diane Burko and Sarah McEnany, who were on view when we closed. And the 3 of us had a talk. We were joined by a woman in LA for a 10 a.m. talk, so it's 7 a.m. for her, and a family in Bombay. So we had Philly folk mostly, but we also had an international and West Coast audience that we would never have had if we offered this program in our auditorium. So I appreciate the question, because it absolutely is a game changer for the museum.
I think that's so great. So Mimi Plevin is back at Mimi Plevin Faust, and she asked, have museums ever acquired work jointly and share the work on a timeshare? That's an interesting question.
That's a great question. Yes, in fact, that became very popular about, Sharon, about, what would you say, about 5-10 years, maybe 10 years ago.
Oh, you would know more than me.
Yeah, more than that, maybe 15-20 years ago.
No, you would know more than me, though. I can't even imagine. I don't know.
Well, it started to happen mostly around video art. So Mimi, museums with video art, which you can mail in a padded envelope to other museums, you could even download it now. Video art proved itself convenient to joint acquisition because you could all own it and all have it, as opposed to, say, a painting that lives in Detroit or Philly or New Orleans. So about 15, 20 years ago, the Guggenheim and LACMA and the High, or Dallas, usually one Southern venue, were often collaborating on joint purchases, and it was usually around video purchases. First of all, they're expensive. They're usually well into the six figures. So it also helped to jointly acquire an edition. And I don't have a whole lot of experience with joint acquisitions. Jody and I, the curator of contemporary art at PAFA, and I have talked about it for PAFA. We haven't done it yet, but only because the opportunity hasn't presented itself. But when I was at Prospect New Orleans, we produced a beautiful video by Jana Comfra. And that video was co-purchased by the Nasher in North Carolina, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and I think the Speed Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. And together they could afford to purchase it. And they bought one edition of 5 and shared the one edition that they co-bought with support from the Via Art Fund. So that definitely happens.
It's so great. Allison Pasquesi, who is also part of our program, one of the exceptional artists who's participating in our residency program, wrote, "I'm struck by your comment, quote, I'm deeply committed to the vernacular voice." She says, quote, vernacular could be interpreted in so many ways. New vernaculars are emerging. She puts vernaculars in quotes. Can you speak a bit about your current personal interest, not specifically PAFA?
Yeah, PAFA doesn't have a whole lot to say in that department yet, but give me 5 more years. and it will have a different voice there.
Oh, that's great.
We just actually were gifted several African-American self-taught artists from the mid-20th century that are deeply new to the collection. And really, I don't know how many of you have worked with museum collections, but it is one of the most gratifying things to do, because when you get a gift that is unlike anything else in the collection, it automatically reshapes the collection. So and it opens up the door for the other thing to come in. So it ends up being a game changer. And we just had an example of that in our last meeting in March.
Fantastic.
Yes, I could talk a lot about vernacular. And the reason, and it's interesting, I think that one of the reasons why I like to live so heartily in that space as a scholar is that it shows all of the weaknesses of art history. And I mean, I love art history. I just want it to change really badly. And vernacular shows you kind of all the holes of art history that you can poke at. Because even by its very nature, vernacular is full of holes. I mean, vernacular in literature means one thing, in music another, and in art history and the visual arts a whole nother thing. So what I like about both of the spaces is that they show the imperfections of language, and they show the imperfections of the science of organization and the science of a discipline like art history. I also happen to love a lot of the art, and you know, I've spent a lot of time there, and oh gosh, you know, self-taught artists are as serious as any trained MFA artist, and in fact are perfecting their skills as much as any MFA artist and student. They just do it differently, and they do it in different sites, and they do it in a way that's relying more on an internal knowledge base than a then a system of support of teachers and administrators and mentors, because often those people don't exist for a lot of self-taught artists. But they are all rooted in the same intentionality to speak their truths and share that. There's a kind of stereotype that self-taught artists don't really want to share their work, that they're kind of isolated from wanting an audience. And even though they're isolated from a mentor and other artists, they always want to share. And any artist that I've ever met deeply wants an audience. So my commitment has been to building those audiences for the vernacular and self-taught artists. And I would say that I've probably done that in spades with the Mexican artist Martin Ramirez, because I've had the real privilege of doing a number of shows that completely reframed the artist. My projects that were very much in collaboration with a lot of other scholars. It's a project you could never do on your own. And our project that we worked on in, 2008, took an artist who most people believed was deaf, mute, and perhaps even a little on the spectrum. And this was a way he had been written about for 70 years or more. And we took an artist who was known with those three definers and made him a Mexican artist with a family who crossed a border, sound familiar, to provide for his family, and circumstances took him in another direction. It was really a reclamation of a man. And it's a great story, and I'd be happy to share it in another forum. I love talking about Martin Ramirez.
So great.
He was thought to not have a family, and that he had no family. And at the opening in New York at the Folk Art Museum in 2008, 17 of his family descendants came to the opening.
Oh, that's so great!
It really shook up an idea of who he was, and it was fun.
Thank you for doing that. Wow. Okay, a couple more questions from the participants of our program. Nicole James asks, I was wondering something similar to Leslie's question previously, in the way tackling the situation of isolation could potentially increase the community and audience. However, being mindful of people who maybe don't have easier access to a computer or internet. I mean, so Nicole, I wonder what the question is. So tackling this situation of isolation could potentially increase the audience. I think that's what you were talking about before, right? I mean, Nicole maybe wants to expand on that a little bit.
It sounds a little bit like we might be talking about our quarantining time. Is that what you're suggesting, Nicole?
She's typing right now, so we'll find out. In the meantime, I have another question here. 1 second. Is Paperbuck, he writes, and he is from, he lives in Pittsburgh, so not so far from you. The transformation of artist practices and the work you've been engaged by and with, from Bearden and Lawrence to your last slide, Sonia Clark's Unraveling, reflects so much about the evolution of American art and politics across your lifetime. How do you think about the position and capacities of the museum in relation to social movements today, the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're interested in relevancy and reciprocity within Philadelphia? That's definitely a great question. I would also add to sanctuary, how are museums also towards the movement of being places for sanctuary as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Paperbuck, for that question. Most museums are founded by majority white founders and donors to perpetrate a story, a myth of American. Well, I'm going to speak specifically about American art, if you don't mind, because that is the sector that we've kind of been dwelling in. to really perpetrate that myth of the American story that most of us were taught in school, and that we all know is a lopsided and actually untruthful tale. So the first thing that has to happen is museums have to be honest with themselves. Mm-hmm. And what I'd say is really great about this time of disruption and transformation is that we are being called out to do so. Museums didn't have the capacity to do that on their own over the last several decades and centuries. So now we're being called out to do it and to recognize our histories and the absences in our histories, the people that we have not collected, exhibited, opened our doors to, put on our board of trustees, hired as professional colleagues. So I am all for museums doing that, and that has to happen before we can in any sincere and impactful way be supportive of Black Lives Matter and other similar social justice movements. We want that. But first, we absolutely have to acknowledge how we have neglected to position ourselves to be an ally and a partner to Black Lives Matter. And without that, we wouldn't have relevancy in Philadelphia. PAFA has been going through a summer of real conflict, which has been shared in the press, where the senior team, of which I'm a part, did issue a statement after the murder of George Floyd in support of Black Lives Matter. And then several of us, about a week later, signed a petition to defund the police in Philadelphia, which, and of course, defunding the police is probably, we all know on this call, is one of the tenets of Black Lives Matter. And we were, as a institution, called out for doing that in the name of PAFA. And it's led to a summer of reckoning for PAFA to really understand and claim where it sits. We are both a school and a museum, and this conflict is really living more in the school, I think, than in the museum, but we're tied. And so it behooves both the museum and the school to be clear about its commitment to, its moral commitment to the Black Lives Matter movement and community in order to have the relevancy in Philadelphia that we are so hungry to have. And so, just to follow up on that, we are now in a time, here it is the end of July, 8:08, and we are in a period of time where our board and our leadership is addressing all that has happened and the dissension that we've gotten from within our community. And in September, if this is of interest to you, and I hope it is, because I think every museum and art school is going to be facing these questions, in September, our leadership will be announcing how we are going to change so that we can be a community member that all sectors of Philadelphia can rely on.
Okay, so I think we're almost, I think someone is typing a question. We have a few minutes left. Oh, Quinn Hunter, who's also part of our program, exceptional artist, says, can both happen simultaneously? I feel like we run out of time to wait for systems to change in the usual way. I mean, I have to agree, is like, why do they have to? It's good to acknowledge it, but then once they do something about it.
Yes. I think action is the imperative, Quinn. So it's probably more my Virgo head in talking to you for the first time where I'm saying this than that, but they absolutely have to happen in the stew and the soup of now and the space that we are in now. And I think our leadership is prepared to do that, thinking just about PAFA. Thinking about museums more broadly, I think they're being pushed. And they probably feel like they're being pushed. And I'd say, let's keep pushing. Change is good and change is necessary. And I get that it's also scary. And I know that it's personal as well as institutional. Institutions are made up of people, so the change will also be meaningful to people. To Quinn and to Paper Buck, I would also say none of us probably know how to do this. So we are also needing to partner to know how to do this well. And I think the best first step is transparency. Transparency. It's like one of my team members said, it's almost like we all need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If I'm sure you're all familiar with what was necessary after the first democratic elections in South Africa. You kind of want that right now for the museum and art world.
Okay, I have a question from Vincent Villega. Let's just go to that. He's going to jump on the screen. Oh, he's no longer there, I guess. Oh, okay. Any other questions that people have oh no, he's here. There he is.
Hi.
Vince.
Hey, Brooke. Can you hear me?
You?
Can you hear me?
This is my husband.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm not sure. It's the first time I've called in, viewed in. Anyway, I love your lecture. Thank you so much. It's great to hear you and your history and all you've done. I was curious. You had touched upon it very briefly in the beginning. Your time with Prospect New Orleans and how you basically wiped out all their debt. Like, you mentioned museum directors are also fundraisers. That's probably a long history behind that, but I'm curious if you care to comment about it, maybe what you learned from it, what worked, what didn't, and then if all those previous directors who amassed all that debt are now indebted to you for the rest of their lives.
Well, one of the things that probably flies against the time that we're in now, what Quinn and Paper Buck and I were just talking about, and not saying this is a plus, but we in museums and the art world are very polite.
I bet.
And, I was just really fortunate to have the great Prospect New Orleans has a terrific board. And Franklin Sermons was the artistic director to my exec director.
And he's so amazing.
He's amazing. And he created a pretty awesome Prospect 3. And I have thought about it a lot, but I think one reason why there are a few reasons why probably we were able to get out of debt. Partly we were a little older and we were maybe just a little more trustworthy to donors who want to see history. They want to see dependability. They want to see that you can actually do what you say you're going to do. So we were building support because Prospect is still a pretty young entity in the scheme of things, right?
Yeah.
So I was probably fortunate in what time that I arrived. So we were building that base to return again and again. But Franklin and I did produce the first one on budget, which is also reassuring for the next one. So then we just did that because we were committed to doing that. And it was still awesome and beautiful and wonderful and challenging and, enraging and gratifying. It did everything, I thought Prospect 3 was amazing. But I think too was this impulse that the board embraced, which was to really get back to New Orleans. It had this early idea that it needed to have a home base in New York to be successful.
Yeah.
And I think the acknowledgement during my time there that New Orleans was their successful space, that should be their focus. I think that also reassured a lot of donors because a lot of donors in the art world are wanting nothing more than for biennials and triennials and museums and other cultural centers to serve the local community. That's really important.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vince. I just have I want to end by just sharing that when we first met, and this is for everyone to hear, I met Brooke through a wonderful person named Kathleen Galander, who is now in Austin, Texas, with her grandchildren and her daughter. And she said to me, I want Brooke to meet you. And so I wrote Brooke, and Brooke wrote me with 4 exclamation points and said, sure. And she opened her door to me in 2002. And ever since, if we run into each other, or she's been so kind to come to events of my book tour, she has always been so generous, but the same person. And so I feel that there are some people in the art world who are real people who can, you can establish a dialogue with. And all I want from Brooke is her to continue doing what she's doing, and selfishly her friendship. So I think, well, thank you. I think everything lying within these values is so important. And I've been talking about that with the participants of our program. And I think you totally live that. So thank you for doing that. And thanks for contributing so much and being an example. And thank you for being with us tonight. And
it was really fun.
I'm so excited for the participants to have the closed door session with you tomorrow at 6 o'clock. And I'll be in touch about that.
Yep, I love the conversation and the questions. Thank you, everybody, for letting me talk about my grandmother. And I just would like to shout out to, hold on, I'm looking for the name. I'm looking at your messages. To Quinn Hunter, yeah. Let's keep talking. So find a way to contact me so we can keep talking.
Well, you will have that. She'll have that chance tomorrow evening. So that would be great. And thank you again. And I also just want to say thank you to your husband. So Jay,
right here.
Oh, he's right over there. Oh my God, that's awesome! Because you shared your house with us. So that's his house too. Okay, so Chip, do you want to put on the next slide? There's a slide that there you are. And I don't know if you know, do you know Siobhan Nichols by chance?
No, but I think I'll join you next week.
Oh, I would love it. So Siobhan is amazing interdisciplinary artist, but she also works for the Joe Mitchell Foundation. So she wears all these multiple hats that I'm always interested in bringing forward, as you do. You wear all these hats under this position, but she wears these hats, nonprofit, as well as art, being an active artist and a mother, and wow. You know, she's just an exceptional person and generous. That word I can never get tired of saying. So she'll be with us next week, and I just want to say thank you to everyone, and also thank you to the Plevin family for making this happen. And Chip, next slide, if you don't mind. I think we have a video that comes on here. And this has been the Virtual Porch, exploring the best values. So if you're ever wanting to know more about us, feel free to come back and visit our website, which is art.chq.org. So with that, thank you, Brooke. Thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a great evening, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again.
Bye.
Good night.